On February 19, 2013, maintenance workers at the Cecil Hotel in downtown Los Angeles climbed to the roof to investigate a problem. Guests on the upper floors had been complaining for days. The water pressure was weak, the color was wrong, the taste was off. Something was contaminating the building's water supply. The workers reached the roof and walked toward the 4 large water tanks that fed the hotel's plumbing system. Each tank was 10 feet tall and 8 feet in diameter, accessible only by ladder. The lids were heavy metal covers designed to prevent tampering. One of the tanks was open. Inside, floating face up in the water, fully clothed, was the body of a 21-year-old woman. She had been there for 19 days. During those 19 days, guests in 600 rooms had showered with that water. They had brushed their teeth, made coffee, filled glasses to drink. The hotel had continued operating normally. No one had noticed anything wrong until the complaints began. Her name was Elisa Lam. She was a Canadian student traveling alone, staying in a shared hostel room on the hotel's 14th floor. The last confirmed sighting of her alive had been in the hotel's elevator on February 1st. Security camera footage from that night showed her behaving strangely, pressing multiple buttons, stepping in and out of the elevator repeatedly, appearing to hide from or speak to someone in the hallway that the camera never captured. The footage would later be viewed millions of times online, analyzed frame by frame, generating theories that ranged from mental health crisis to supernatural possession to elaborate murder conspiracies. But Elisa Lam was not the Cecil Hotel's first tragedy. She was not even close to the first. By the time her body was discovered in 2013, the Cecil had accumulated a history so dense with violence and death that it had earned a reputation as the most haunted, most cursed, most evil hotel in America. 16 verified murders or suicides had occurred in or near the building since it opened in 1924. The actual number was almost certainly higher, but records from the hotel's early decades are incomplete, and many deaths were never properly documented. The Cecil story is not about ghosts. It is about architecture, economics, geography, and the way American cities abandon entire populations to violence and despair, while tourists walk past on their way to nicer destinations. It is about a building that was designed for one purpose and transformed by forces beyond any architect's control into something else entirely. It is about what happens when a structure outlives its original function but continues to stand because tearing it down would be more expensive than letting it slowly consume the people
This
inside.
is that story. The Cecil Hotel opened on December 20th, 1924, at 640 South Main Street in downtown Los Angeles. The location was not accidental. Main Street in the mid-1920s was the commercial heart of the city. Department stores lined the sidewalks. Theaters drew crowds every evening. The new hotel district was rising several blocks south of the original downtown core, and developers were racing to claim the best positions. William Banks Hanner, the hotel's developer, hired the architectural firms of Loy Lester Smith and Edward B. Eisen to design a building that would attract middle-class business travelers and tourists. The architects delivered plans for a 12-story structure in the Beaux Arts style, later expanded to 14 stories. 700 guest rooms would be arranged along double-loaded corridors. Each floor would have shared bathrooms at the corridor ends, a common configuration for moderately priced hotels of the era. The ground floor would feature a lobby with marble columns, decorative plasterwork, and a grand staircase, suggesting elegance that the upper floors would not quite deliver. Construction proceeded through 1923 and 1924. The building that emerged was respectable, but not luxurious. Room rates were set at $1.50 per night, positioning the Cecil in the middle tier of Los Angeles accommodations. It could not compete with the grand hotels downtown, but it offered more comfort than the flophouses and rooming houses that clustered near the train stations. The target market was traveling salesmen, families visiting Los Angeles for a few days, and long-term residents who needed temporary housing while establishing themselves in the city. The Cecil Hotel opened during a period of tremendous growth in Los Angeles. The population had exploded from 100,000 in 1900 to over 500,000 by 1924. The film industry was establishing itself in Hollywood. Oil discoveries were generating enormous wealth. Real estate speculation was driving construction throughout the region. Downtown Los Angeles was transforming from a frontier town into a modern American city, and the Cecil Hotel was designed to serve the thousands of people flowing through that transformation. For the first few years, the hotel succeeded. Occupancy rates were high. The location on Main Street proved valuable. Guests appreciated the cleanliness and the reasonable prices. The Cecil was exactly what it had been designed to be, a functional, profitable, unremarkable hotel in a growing city. Then, the Depression arrived. The stock market crashed in October 1929. By 1930, the construction boom that had driven Los Angeles's growth was over. Banks failed, businesses closed, unemployment rose from virtually nothing to 25% within 2 years. The thousands of people who had been moving to Los Angeles looking for opportunity were now desperately searching for any kind of work or shelter. The Cecil Hotel's middle-class guests disappeared almost overnight. Business travelers stopped traveling, tourists stopped touring. Families who might have spent a few days in Los Angeles on vacation were now focused on survival. The hotel faced a choice: close and wait for the economy to recover, or find new tenants willing to pay whatever they could afford.
The Cecil chose survival. Room rates dropped. Standards for accepting guests were loosened. People who would not have been welcomed in 1928 were now paying customers in 1931. The hotel began attracting longer-term residents, individuals who were not traveling but who had nowhere else to live. These were not vacationers. They were people at the bottom of an economic collapse, clinging to the last remnants of indoor housing before falling into homelessness. The building's character changed quickly. Noise levels increased. Maintenance declined. The marble lobby lost its polish. The decorative plasterwork cracked and was not repaired. The shared bathrooms, acceptable for short-term guests who used them occasionally, became problematic when every room was occupied by permanent residents who had no other facilities. The Cecil was no longer a hotel in the traditional sense. It was becoming something else, a warehouse for people who had run out of options. And then the violence began. The first documented suicide at the Cecil Hotel occurred in 1931, less than 7 years after the building opened. A guest leaped from one of the upper-floor windows and died on the sidewalk below. The newspapers reported the death briefly. The hotel management expressed regret. The window was not modified. Nothing changed. Another suicide followed in 1932. Then another in 1934. The pattern was establishing itself. Guests who checked into the Cecil Hotel sometimes never checked out. They ended their lives in those rooms, and the hotel continued operating, cleaning the space, renting it to the next person who needed a bed. The reasons for the suicides varied, but the underlying causes were consistent: economic despair, loss of employment, family separation, substance addiction, mental illness untreated and unacknowledged. The Depression did not simply make people poor, it destroyed their sense of purpose and future.
For some, a cheap hotel room on an upper floor offered a final solution that required only the courage to open a window. Los Angeles in the 1930s had no comprehensive social safety net. Homeless shelters were few and inadequate. Mental health services were primitive and inaccessible to those without money. Addiction was treated as a moral failure, not a medical condition. The Cecil Hotel and buildings like it became the last stop for people in crisis. The fact that some of them chose to die there was not evidence of anything supernatural or cursed. It was evidence of a social system that had abandoned them completely. By 1940, the Cecil had established a reputation among Los Angeles residents. It was known as a place where desperate people lived and sometimes died. That reputation did not deter guests who had no better options. For someone with $2 and nowhere else to sleep, the Cecil's history was irrelevant. The hotel continued to fill its rooms because the population that needed cheap housing kept growing. The Second World War brought temporary relief. Defense industry jobs drew workers to Los Angeles. Soldiers passed through the city on their way to Pacific deployments. The economy recovered enough that some people moved out of permanent hotel residence and into more stable housing. But the Cecil's core clientele remained. The building had crossed a threshold. It was no longer possible to return to its original function as a respectable middle-class hotel. Too much had happened. Too many people had died. The structure itself had absorbed a different identity.
After the war ended in 1945, downtown Los Angeles began a long decline that would last for decades. The city's growth shifted westward and into the suburbs. Middle-class families moved to new housing developments in the San Fernando Valley and Orange County. The downtown hotels that had thrived in the 1920s found themselves competing for a shrinking market. Many closed or converted to other uses. The Cecil remained open because it had already adjusted to serve the population that no one else wanted. Skid Row, the concentration of homeless services and transient housing that would define downtown Los Angeles for the rest of the century, was forming just blocks from the Cecil Hotel. By the 1950s, the area around Main Street had become the destination for people at the absolute bottom of the economic hierarchy. Missions served meals. Shelters offered beds on a first-come basis. Cheap hotels provided rooms by the week or month for those who could afford them. The Cecil was part of that ecosystem, neither the worst option nor the best, simply another building in a neighborhood that the rest of Los Angeles preferred to ignore. The hotel's management adapted to the reality. Security became more important than decoration. The lobby, once designed to impress, was now designed to control access. The front desk staff learned to recognize signs of trouble before it escalated. Room checks became more frequent to ensure that tenants were alive and paying. The business model shifted from hospitality to housing management. And the distinction mattered because housing management in Skid Row required different skills than running a tourist hotel. The deaths continued throughout the 1950s and 1960s. Some were suicides, others were overdoses. A few were murders, though the line between murder and fatal assault in a building where violence was common was not always clear. Police responded to calls at the Cecil Hotel multiple times per month. Ambulances arrived regularly. The building became familiar to every officer and paramedic who worked downtown. In 1962, a woman named Pauline Otten jumped from the 9th-floor window of her room, landing on a pedestrian below and killing both herself and the man she struck. The double death made headlines briefly, then faded. The Cecil Hotel continued operating. The room was cleaned and rented out again. In 1964, a woman was found dead in her room, raped and stabbed. The case was never solved. The killer was never identified. The hotel management cooperated with police, but the investigation went nowhere. The murder joined the growing list of violent deaths associated with the building.
These were not isolated incidents. They were patterns. The Cecil Hotel was accumulating a history of trauma at a rate that exceeded statistical probability. Other cheap hotels in Los Angeles had crime and deaths, but not at this concentration. Something about the Cecil attracted or produced violence in ways that even contemporary observers noticed. The building's reputation grew darker with each incident, and that reputation began to attract a different kind of attention. Serial killers stayed at the Cecil Hotel, not metaphorically, not as legend, actually stayed there, checked in under their own names or aliases, paid for rooms, and used the building as a base while committing murders elsewhere in Los Angeles. The Cecil's combination of cheap rates, minimal security, transient population, and location near downtown made it ideal for predators who wanted anonymity and access. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, stayed on the 14th floor of the Cecil Hotel during his 1985 killing spree. He paid $14 per night for a room and used the hotel as his base while terrorizing Los Angeles. He would return to the Cecil after committing murders, walk through the lobby covered in blood, and no one stopped him. The staff had learned not to ask questions. The other residents had learned not to see things that might get them involved with dangerous people. Ramirez stayed at the Cecil for weeks before police finally connected him to the murders and captured him elsewhere in the city. Jack Unterweger, an Austrian journalist and convicted murderer who had been released from prison and reinvented himself as a celebrity writer, stayed at the Cecil Hotel in 1991 while on assignment for an Austrian magazine. He was writing about crime in Los Angeles. During his stay, he murdered 3 sex workers in the city, strangling them in the same manner he had used in his previous murders in Austria. He checked out of the Cecil, returned to Europe, and continued killing before being arrested, tried, and ultimately dying by suicide in prison. The hotel was not choosing to harbor serial killers. It was simply accepting anyone with money for a room, which, in a neighborhood where most people had nothing, meant that even murderers could find shelter. The Cecil Hotel asked no questions, because asking questions would have meant turning away paying customers, and turning away customers would have meant closing the business.
By the 1990s, the Cecil's reputation had solidified. It was known among true crime enthusiasts and urban explorers as a location with unusual concentrations of death and violence. The building appeared in books and documentaries about Los Angeles's dark history. Tour guides included it in their routes through downtown's most notorious locations. The Cecil Hotel had become famous for being infamous, and that fame created its own feedback loop. People who were interested in darkness sought out the Cecil specifically because of its history, ensuring that the population living there remained skewed toward those fascinated by or comfortable with violence. The hotel changed hands multiple times over the decades. Each new owner promised improvements and renovations that would restore the building to respectability. Some work was done. Fresh paint was applied. Security cameras were installed. The lobby was updated with new furniture. But the fundamental problem remained unchanged. The Cecil Hotel was a 14-story building with 700 rooms in a neighborhood that no middle-class person wanted to visit. No amount of cosmetic improvement could overcome that reality. In 2007, the hotel underwent a significant renovation and rebranded as Stay on Main. The new management converted the upper floors into hostel-style accommodations with shared rooms at extremely low prices, targeting international backpackers who wanted cheap lodging in Los Angeles and were either unaware of or unconcerned by the building's history. The lower floors continued to operate as permanent housing for long-term residents, many of whom had lived in the building for years or decades. The strategy created a bizarre juxtaposition. Young European and Asian tourists shared elevators with elderly Skid Row residents who had nowhere else to go. Backpackers looking for adventure in Los Angeles found themselves in hallways with people experiencing severe mental illness or addiction. The hotel was trying to serve two completely incompatible populations simultaneously, and the result was predictable conflict and discomfort on all sides. The tourists complained about noise, about disturbing encounters in hallways, about feeling unsafe. The long-term residents resented the presence of outsiders who were slumming through their home. Management tried to mediate, establishing separate entrances and floors for tourists versus residents, but the building's design made complete separation impossible. Everyone used the same elevators, everyone passed through the same lobby. The Cecil Hotel, even under its new name, could not escape what it had become. Elisa Lam checked in to Stay on Main on January 26, 2013. She was traveling alone, having left Vancouver to visit California. She had been diagnosed with bipolar disorder and depression and was taking medication to manage both conditions. Her family would later state that she had been struggling, but seemed excited about the trip. She planned to visit San Diego and Santa Cruz after Los Angeles.
She checked in for 4 nights initially, then extended her stay. She was moved from a shared room to a private room on the 14th floor. According to her social media posts, she was enjoying the trip, taking photographs, visiting bookstores and record shops downtown. She seemed to be functioning normally. On February 1st, hotel staff saw her in the lobby. She was checking her phone and appeared to be waiting for someone. At some point that day or evening, she entered an elevator on one of the upper floors. The security camera footage from that elevator would become one of the most viewed and analyzed pieces of video in internet history. The footage shows Elisa entering the elevator and pressing multiple buttons. The elevator does not move. She steps out into the hallway, looks in both directions, then steps back into the elevator. She presses more buttons. She stands in the corner of the elevator, appearing to hide. She steps out again, gestures as if talking to someone in the hallway that the camera cannot see, then steps back in. She presses every button on the panel. The elevator door remains open the entire time. After more than 2 minutes of this behavior, she finally leaves the elevator and does not return. The elevator door closes, and the car begins moving normally. The footage generated immediate speculation when police released it to the public after Elisa Lam was reported missing by her family on February 6th. Why was she behaving so strangely? Who was she hiding from? Why wouldn't the elevator door close? Theories proliferated online. Some claimed she was being chased by a killer who the camera did not capture. Others suggested paranormal possession or psychological breakdown. Internet detectives analyzed every frame, proposing elaborate scenarios involving conspiracies, hidden assailants, and hotel cover-ups. The investigation focused on the hotel building. Police searched rooms, interviewed staff and guests, and reviewed additional security footage. Elisa Lam had simply vanished somewhere between the elevator on February 1st and whenever she might have accessed the roof where her body was eventually found. The roof was not easily accessible. It required passing through an alarmed door or climbing an exterior fire escape. The metal lid on the tank where Elisa's body was found had to be lifted off and set aside. Police determined that she could have reached the roof and accessed the tank herself, but the mechanics of how she climbed into the tank closed the lid from inside and remained there without being discovered for 19 days raised questions that were never fully answered.
The autopsy found no evidence of physical trauma. Toxicology tests found her prescription medications in her system, but at levels suggesting she had not been taking them consistently. The medical examiner ultimately ruled her death an accidental drowning, noting her bipolar disorder as a significant factor.
The finding was that Elisa Lam, experiencing a mental health crisis, had accessed the roof, climbed into the water tank for reasons that could not be determined, and drowned accidentally when she was unable to climb back out. The explanation satisfied investigators, but not the public. The video footage, the inaccessible roof, the locked water tank lid, and the 19 days that her body floated undetected all contradicted the simple narrative of accidental death during a mental health crisis. Theories continued circulating online for years. The Cecil Hotel's dark history amplified every suspicion. The building itself became part of the evidence that something more sinister had occurred. But the truth was simpler and more tragic. Elisa Lam had been struggling with mental illness. She had traveled alone to a city where she knew no one and checked into a hotel with a long history of housing people in crisis. The elevator footage showed someone experiencing a break from reality, seeing or hearing things that were not there, unable to process her environment normally. She had wandered to the roof, perhaps seeking escape or relief, or following some internal logic that made sense only to her in that moment. She had climbed into the water tank and been unable to get out. She had drowned alone, while hundreds of people slept in rooms below her. The fact that her death occurred at the Cecil Hotel added mystery and speculation, but it did not change the fundamental reality. She died because she was sick and alone and unprotected in a building that had been accumulating such deaths for nearly 90 years. The Cecil Hotel closed in 2017 for renovations. The new owners announced plans to convert the building into affordable housing with wraparound social services for formerly homeless residents. The project has stalled multiple times due to financing issues and bureaucratic complications. As of this writing, the building remains closed and empty. 14 stories of dark red brick and limestone facing still rise above Main Street in downtown Los Angeles. The windows are dark. The lobby is locked. The roof where Elisa Lam died and where so many others chose to end their lives is sealed. The water tanks have been drained and removed. The neighborhood around the Cecil has begun gentrifying. New apartment buildings are rising on nearby blocks. Coffee shops and restaurants are opening for the young professionals moving downtown. The transformation that city planners have been promising for decades is finally occurring. But Skid Row remains just blocks away. The homeless population that was temporarily displaced by development is being pushed into smaller and smaller areas of concentrated poverty. The systems that created the Cecil Hotel's history have not been dismantled. They have simply moved. The building will likely reopen eventually. Some version of the renovation will be completed. The Cecil Hotel will be given another new name and another fresh start. Perhaps this time it will succeed in becoming something other than what it has been. Perhaps the history can be overwritten by better years and better outcomes. Or perhaps the structure itself retains something that cannot be painted over or renovated away. Not ghosts, not curses, but the accumulated weight of 90 years of human suffering compressed into concrete and steel. The memory of every person who died there, by choice or violence or accident. The knowledge that this building was where people came when they had nowhere else to go and nothing else to lose. The Cecil Hotel is not haunted, it is not cursed, it is not evil. It is a monument to what American cities do to the people they abandon. It is architecture as evidence. Every suicide, every murder, every overdose, every death that occurred within those walls was the result of systems that failed long before the victim checked in. The hotel simply provided the stage where those failures reached their conclusion. If you want to understand the Cecil Hotel, you do not need paranormal investigators or conspiracy theories. You need to understand economics, housing policy, mental health care, addiction treatment, and the way American society has chosen for a century to warehouse its most vulnerable people in buildings like this rather than addressing the conditions that put them there. The darkness at the Cecil Hotel was never supernatural. It was always profoundly, horrifyingly human.